door opened, closed. I heard him breathing nervously, and then his whisper in the darkness. "Dylan, what?" "Everything's swell," I spoke softly. "She's up in her room now writing the statement. I'm going up to check it over."
"Oh? Then why am I?"
"I want you to look at it before we leave. It's okay. She won't know you're here until I get my hands on it."
"Well..."
He gave up and chuckled. I was his pal. I was the brain man. I was taking care of him. He was a simple guy, and there was this other thing on his mind.
"All day I have been trying to remember, Dylan. Such a crazy thing. How does it go, that song we were singing? The one about the bastard king of England."
"Song? Is that what—" "Turn on the light, Pete." I accidentally brushed the switch with my sleeve when... You'll have to turn around. It's there on your right, back near the door. I saw the black shadow that was his body revolve in the darkness. I heard his fingers tracing their way along the wallpaper. Then the chuckle again, almost childish.
"Such a foolish thing at a time like this. No attention you should pay me. Later, perhaps, when..."
"No. This is a good time. Here's the way it goes, Pete. Cats on the rooftops, cats on the tiles, cats with their bottoms wreathed in smiles." The light went on. His back was to me like it had to be. I got him 6 times through the head and neck. He pitched forward, and that was the end of him. I made sure of it. I checked him before I left. His face was pretty much of a mess, but it looked like he died happy. It looked like he was grinning. Well, I'd done it to him, and I was wearing gloves, but I wiped the gun off good and put it in the old woman's hand, and just as I'd finished, this Mona shows up with the money, and she sees this Nazi or communist or whatever he was, and she goes all to pieces, acts like I was a criminal or something, acted like I hadn't done it all for her. Well, she pulled herself together when she saw how jarred I was. She said it was just a shock seeing him there when she hadn't expected to, that she just didn't like to have it happen to anyone unless it was her aunt, and she was sorry, and so on, and she'd do whatever I asked. So I'm a pretty understanding guy, and I kind of liked her for feeling that way, if she did actually feel that way. So everything was Jake between us again. I told her what she was supposed to do, what to say to the cops. I told her it would be a cinch, and in a couple of weeks we could get together. And I kissed her and left, taking the money with me. The money, was in a black leather bag, something like a doctor's medicine kit. It was packed tight, and it was heavy, about 60 or 70 pounds. I got home and took it into the house. I set my sample case up on the coffee table, opened the lid, and tried fitting the bag inside. I fiddled around with it, trying it this way and that way. I was delaying the pleasure, I guess, letting my anticipation build up. And I guess probably I was a little afraid, because with a hard-luck guy like me, damn near anything can happen. That little satchel might turn out to be filled with bricks or magazines or some kind of booby trap that would blow my head off when... I opened it. I made myself look inside, and I moaned. It was there, all right. Packs and packs of paper-banded bills, 5s, 10s, and 20s. I dipped my hands down into it and brought them up again. It was all money. I didn't have to count it. Hell, I could almost count it in my head. 100 grand. 100 grand. And Mona. I'd rescued her from her wicked aunt and meted out justice to this guy who had molested her, and I'd recovered this money which was rightfully hers. And soon we would depart this scene of my many tragic disappointments, and we would go to some sunny clime like Mexico, and man... what a happy life we'd lead. Me and that sweet child, that honey babe, and $100,000. I dipped into the money again, squeezing and rubbing it between my fingers, hating to let go of it. It was old, but still clean and crisp, and yeah, it was the real thing. I cannot be deceived about counterfeit. You get stuck a few times when you are an innocent, trusting kid and have to make it up out of your own pocket, and you learn to spot the goddamn stuff 100 yards away. I took $30 from a packet of 5s and stuffed them into my wallet. That would give me a good day at the store and keep this unappreciative character Staples from giving me a hard time. I dropped the rest of the pack into the satchel and started to fasten the catch. I was a happy man, had forged onward and upward against unequal odds. But though I seldom complain, you have doubtless read between the lines, and you know that I am one hard-luck bastard. So now, right as I stood on the doorstep of dreams come true, my whole world crumpled beneath me. And I had all this dough, and I had Mona, or I soon would have her, and then I looked up, and she was in her nightgown. She was all prettied up, like I hadn't seen her since I don't know when. And she wasn't more than a dozen feet away, standing in the entrance to the little hall that led back to the bedroom, smiling at me, but sort of watchful, kind of smile frowning. Joyce. My wife. I didn't think she'd seen the money. I wasn't sure, but the lid of the sample case was up, and it wasn't likely that she would have. I let it drop casually, the lid, I mean, and locked it. I said, "What the hell are you doing here?" Her eyes flashed, but she held on to the smile.
I still had my key, Dolly.
So you had a key.
Please, Dolly, don't make it any harder for me than it is.
And you never made anything hard for me, did you? You didn't do your goddamn best to wreck this house before you left. You didn't screw up every goddamn stitch of clothes I had. You didn't...
I'm sorry, Dolly, but I've thought things over, and if you'll just listen to me...
Listening to dames like you is what's put me where I am today. All right, spill it. I'm listening. I decided I'd better, because maybe she had seen that dough, and anyway, this is no time to get into a brawl. I had to live nice and quiet for the next few weeks. My nerves wouldn't take anything else, and anything that might draw attention to me just wasn't safe. She hesitated, looking at me, a little suspicious, I guess, of the sudden change. Well, come on, give. Sit down, and I'll get us a drink.
I don't think I want a drink. You've been drinking quite a bit, haven't you, Dolly? There's all kinds of bottles around, and it looks like you slept in the bed with your shoes on, and...
I was staring at her, not saying anything. She cut off with a nagging fast, stretched her smile.
Just listen to me, will you? I'm not back in the house an hour, and already I'm... You get us a drink, honey. Please.
I got a bottle out of the cupboard and a couple of glasses. I came back into the living room, and she was sitting in the same chair Pete had sat in. It gave me an awfully funny feeling. I poured the drinks and handed her one. My hands shook, and I patted the lounge at my side. Why so unsociable? Why not sit over here?
You really want me to?
What the hell, sure. She sat down on the lounge, kind of crossways to me.
Well, here I am.
Yeah. There you are, all right.
I guess it would be too much to hope you're glad to see me.
I let myself frown a little. I took a sip of my drink, lighted a cigarette, and passed her one. Well, it's a funny deal. A guy's wife wrecks damn near everything he has, and then she takes off for a week, almost a week. Then he thinks it all over. He doesn't know where the hell she's been, what she's been doing. She shows back up without any warning, and for all he knows...
I've been in Kansas City, Dolly. I started back to Houston. I was going to get my old job back.
Where'd you get the money?
From the owner of the club. I called him collect after I left here that night, and he wired me $200 to get back on.
Oh.
Oh, please don't act like that, honey. You know there's never been anyone but you.
I didn't say anything. So you stopped off in K.C., huh?
Yeah. I had a 4-hour layover there between trains, and then I was going on, but I don't know quite how to put it, honey. Maybe it was getting off by myself for a while. I could see the whole picture, the good and the bad, and it began to look a lot different to me. I wasn't sure that I should come back, but I felt that I should at least think about it. So that's what I did. I took a room in Kansas City, and I really thought. It was quiet and peaceful, and there wasn't something to upset me the minute I...
Like me, for example?
I've been more to blame than you, Dolly. Entirely to blame, I guess. I was responsible for the way I acted.
Well, I'm not throwing anything up to you, you understand, but as long as you mention the subject yourself, I turned and looked at her, feeling the blood push up into my face. What the hell you mean you were responsible?
Please, honey, I'm here to help you. I love you, and I'm your wife, and it's a wife's place to stick by her husband.
I poured myself another drink, the neck of the bottle rattling against the glass. I threw it down at a gulp, and it calmed me down a little bit, but only on the outside. It didn't change the way I felt. You think I'm crazy. Is that it? Well, it wouldn't be any goddamn wonder if I was. I've been knocking myself out for people almost from the time I began to walk, and all I got for it was a royal screwing. It's like it was a plot, almost. The whole goddamn world sitting up nights to figure out how to give me a hard time. It was all true, by God, but somehow saying it out loud just then, it didn't sound so good. Well, anyway, you've got to admit I've had plenty of hard luck.
Of course you have, dear. So have a lot of other people.
A lot of other people, hell. You name me just one person that's got the rooking I've got, in his work, and his home life, and... I stopped myself again. She slid over on the lounge, put one of her hands over mine.
You do see it, don't you, honey? And now that you understand and I understand, we can do something about it.
I'd do something about it, all right. She may have thought she had a tough time before, but she hadn't seen anything yet. I'd have run her out of here inside of a week, long before Mona and I were due to get together.
I don't want to upset you, honey, but there's something I want to ask.
Yeah? Well, go ahead.
Maybe I'd better not. Not tonight. I'm sure you wouldn't,
Come on, spit it out.
Well, about the money, Dolly!
I let go of her wrists, grinned, and gave it a little pat. It had been a dumb thing to do, to cut her off before she had a chance to say whatever she was going to. But I just hadn't been able to help myself. Excuse, please. I guess seeing you in that nightgown, I kind of lost my head. Now, what about the money?
Well, nothing. Do you really like the gown, honey?
Love it. What about the money? She hesitated. Then she smiled and shook her head.
Nothing, honey. I was just going to say that, well, I had quite a bit of money left from cashing in my ticket and all, and, of course I'll have to pay it back, but we could use it for a while, and...
She went on smiling at me. She was a goddamn liar, like every other woman I'd ever known, but I couldn't be sure she was lying now. I won't say I couldn't use a little extra money.
I'll give it to you in the morning. Be sure and remind me of it.
Those deadbeats have really been giving me a time. The rotten bastards, you think they were trying to see how hard... Well, skip it. I must be beginning to sound like one long gripe.
It's all right, darling. Don't ever be afraid to talk to me.
Anyway, I caught up with a flock of them tonight. Pulled in a nice little wad of dough. Ought to make Staples act halfway decent toward me for a change.
Wonderful. I'm so glad for you, honey.
And it seemed to me that her smile became more real. The watchfulness went out of her. I pulled her over on my lap. She put her hands back of my head and pulled my face down to hers, and I thought we weren't ever coming up for air. But you don't hear me kicking. She was a lot of woman, that Joyce. She had the face, and she had the build. It wasn't hard to forget for a little while that she was plain no good. She pulled away at last and lay back, smiling up at me, wiggling and breathing pretty hard as I made with the hands.
Oh, Dolly, we're going to be happy, aren't we?
Hell, I'm happy right now.
Do you really like my nightgown, honey?
I don't like anything that covers you up. She laughed and pulled my head down again and whispered in my ear.
I'll tell you something, honey. It's a new kind of gown. It comes off.
Well, afterwards, after she'd gone to sleep, I got up to get a drink of water, and on the way to the bedroom, I locked the sample case and put the key in my pocket. I got back into bed and closed my eyes. It was as though a guard had been taken away from a gate, or a door suddenly thrown open, letting in 100 images that I hadn't looked at, letting them all rush in at me at once. The old woman and Pete, the way she'd looked, the way he'd looked, her head swinging like a pumpkin, her body sprawled on the stairs, his face and neck, the way he chuckled when he asked me. I screamed. I flung myself up in bed, rocking and screaming and crying, "Oh, God Almighty, my God!" Then there was someone else saying,
"Oh, my God, darling."
And Joyce was holding on to me, her body rocking with mine. "I'm sorry, God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it,
Lie down and Mother will hold her boy. Mother's never going to leave her boy again. She's going to stay right here and hold him close. He's with Mother and he's safe, and Mother will understand whatever.
I must have been having a nightmare,
There. Everything's going to be all right, darling. Lie down now and... There.
She pulled me back down. She moved her pillow up a little and moved mine down a little.
There. That's my boy. Now down a little. Just a little more. And then closer, darling. Very close to Mother.
And she drew me close and slid the gown down off her shoulders. Joyce was up ahead of me the next morning. By the time I dressed, she'd had breakfast waiting, and she didn't say a word about the night before. I'd been sort of worried about that, worried and kind of ashamed, but she didn't let out a peep about it or let on like there'd been a thing out of the way. So that day was started off right from the beginning. She kept a little of the money from her trip for groceries and gave me the rest. She gave me a love pat now and then while she was waiting on me, and I got a big hug and a kiss when I was ready to leave.
Notice anything? I've got a house dress on, and my hair is combed, and my face is made up, and... Did you notice?
I started to say, "So what? You want me to shoot off skyrockets?" But it just wasn't that kind of morning, so I said, "You're darn right I noticed. You look swell, baby."
You'll be right home tonight?
Sure. Why wouldn't I come right home?
I just wanted to know, so that I could have dinner ready.
Something on your mind? I said. Anything bothering you? Her face fell a little. At the tone of my voice, I figured. Then she stood on tiptoe and kissed me again, and she said, laughing,
Yes, you. I've got you on my mind. Now run along so I can get some work done.
I started for town. On the way in, I stopped and bought a newspaper, and I had a hard moment or two before I found the story and made myself read it. It was okay. It was swell. The case was so open and shut that it hadn't even made the front pages. It was back on page 3, and there was only about a half a column of it. Mona had been in bed asleep and had been awakened by the sounds of struggle. At first, too terrified to investigate, she had finally forced herself to, when the sound of several shots was followed by a prolonged silence. Mrs. Farrell's niece identified Hendrickson as a one-time odd jobs man in her aunt's employ. He had quit, swearing vengeance, she said, after a dispute over his wages. As police reconstructed the case, Hendrickson returned to the house last night, drinking and surly, and demanded payment of the disputed sum. Angered by the elderly woman's refusal, he gave her a near-fatal beating, robbed her, and started to flee. Mrs. Farrell managed to follow him to the head of the stairs and shoot him. She then fell and broke her neck, although it is believed she would have died anyway as a result of the beating. Police revealed that Hendrickson had a record of arrests for drunkenness, disorderly conduct, and battery. He recently completed a 6-month jail sentence for assaulting an officer. That was about it, all that's important. Mona had recited her story just as I'd given it to her, and thank God there weren't any pictures. If they'd gotten her picture and she hadn't kept her face covered like she was crying like I told her to, I'd have had some questions to answer. Staples would have recognized her as the girl who bailed me out of jail, and he'd have been mighty curious about it. He'd have wanted to know what I was to her and she to me, and just where I was last night at the time of the killings. But there weren't any pictures. The case was too open and shut. The people involved just weren't important enough. I stopped at the store and checked in and out. I went to work trying to figure out some place where I might stash that dough. It was awkward to lug around with me, and the samples didn't cover it too well. I thought about it all morning as I drove around. I thought of a couple of places, but they weren't any good. I had to keep it with me. I'd just have to take the stuff out of the case that I was going to show people, and I wasn't going to show very damn much. I wasn't going to do very damn much work at all. As for Joyce, I could handle her. She was afraid of getting me sore, and I wouldn't need to give her any explanations. I'd just tell her to go down to the store if she wanted anything. I was tired of getting my samples screwed up. I'd keep the case locked and tell her to keep the hell away from it. I framed the words in my mind, just how I'd tell her off if she started nosing around, and then I got to thinking about last night, and I decided it wouldn't be necessary to talk to her that way. I'd say, "Now, honey, I'm not even going to let your pretty fingers touch that junk. You just tell old Dolly what you want, and he'll bring you home something good." I knocked off work about 1 o'clock and checked my take. I had $28, pretty good for a morning, but nothing at all for a day, of course. But with that other 30, the 6 5s I'd taken from the $100,000, it would make me a plenty good day. I stopped in a bar. I ordered a sandwich and a bottle of ale, and took it over to the booth. I ate and drank. I got another ale and spread out my collection cards. I picked out 6 accounts that owed us $5 each. I marked them up on the cards, shifted the 30 from my wallet to the company cash bag, and that was it. It was about 2 o'clock by now. I moved on to another bar, buying a late paper on the way. They'd cut the story down to about 3 paragraphs in this one. There was nothing new in it, or rather nothing that mattered. The house and the furniture were just about the sum total of the old woman's estate, and it seemed like she was so far behind in her taxes that the property would just about cover 'em. She hadn't left any will. Mona was her only known survivor, and so on. Nothing that mattered. Everything was still okay. I ordered my second double shot and another ale for a chaser. It was funny about those taxes, the old woman not paying them. All that dough, and she'd let the taxes pile up until the county was on the point of taking over. But maybe it wasn't so strange. She'd been tight-fisted about everything else, living on beans and junk, making Mona lay for everyone that came along. Mona. She was plenty sweet, and I was in love with her. But I'd fallen in love before, thinking I was getting something special. And how had it turned out? How did I know it wouldn't turn out the same way with her? I'd had enough goddamn tramps to last me a lifetime. I was sure that she wasn't one. Pretty sure. But if I ever got the notion that she was, brother, look out. Joyce, now, well, I've talked pretty rough about Joyce, and she was as lazy and sloppy and ornery as they come, but there was always one thing I was sure of, pretty sure, damn sure, regardless of what I said. She didn't play around. If she'd been as square about other things as she'd been about that, if she kept up this act she'd been putting on since she'd been back, if it was an act, I figure it just about had to be, because a leopard don't change her spots. But it was a damn good one, as good as the real thing, so what the hell was the difference? Joyce. Yeah, Joyce had her points all right. And now that I wouldn't have to knock myself out to make a living, now that I could feel like I amounted to something and we could have nice things and... But that was the trouble. The money. How could I explain to her about the money? What kind of story could I hand her? Well, I drank another round and left the place. I got some black coffee and started driving again, just killing time. It was 4 o'clock, more than 2 hours before I could check in at the store and get home to Joyce. Joyce. Mona. Joyce? Mona? What the hell? I thought, and I tried to push it out of my mind. Mona was a good kid. Anyone could see she was. And she'd carried through on this deal like a little brick, doing what she was told, helping to murder her own aunt for her dough. She was on the square, all right. She damn well better be, because I knew Joyce was. And if I could just think up the right kind of story to account for that $100,000... I drove around until after 6, making myself look good. Then I checked in at the store, bustling in like I'd been on the run all day, and Staples' eyebrows went up a little when he saw what I had for him. "Not bad, Frank." "Gee, thanks." We said goodnight, and I started to leave, and he called me back.
"By the way, I see that a couple of your customers came to a violent end last night. One of your customers, I should say, and the relative of one."
"Yeah, I read about that. Too damn bad they don't all get bumped off."
"Oh, now, Frank, what would we do for customers?"
"I mean it. If every one of the rotten bastards dropped dead of the bleeding piles, it would tickle me pink."
"It really would, wouldn't it? But this Farrell case, there's an angle of it which struck me as being rather curious."
"Yeah, it did?"
"Uh-huh. Mrs. Farrell was apparently a virtual pauper, yet her niece, her dependent, spends $33 for a chest of silverware."
He stood looking at me, eyebrows cocked, waiting. I swallowed, and it sounded, by God, like Niagara Falls. What about it?
You actually don't see anything contradictory in the situation?
Well, I'll tell you.
Yes, Frank?
I'll tell you the way I feel, Stape. These bastards we got on our books, I don't try to figure them out. It's no use. Know what I mean? If they weren't nutty as a pecan orchard, they wouldn't be trading with us.
Well, yes. I can't say that I disagree with you. You'd attribute this, then, to merely another of the mental aberrations peculiar to our clientele? Spending their last dollar on...
I don't. I don't even try to figure them out. All I'm interested in is, have they got the money, and can I get it away from them?
Hear, hear. Spoken like a true pay-easy man. Well, toodaloo, dear boy, and pleasant dreams.
I started for the door again. He called to me again. For God's sake, what the hell do you want now, Stape? It ain't enough I knock myself out all day. I gotta stand around here half the goddamn night talking to you.
Why, Frank, I do believe you're annoyed with me. Is there something about this case that, Did I say something that disturbed you?
I told him sure he disturbed me, hanging on to me this time of night when I wanted to get home and get my shoes off and get some grub under my belt.
I see. You feel a twinge of conscience. Mrs. Farrell tipped you off to Pete's whereabouts, didn't she? And he no doubt guessed as much, and...
So why should that bother me? It all turned out all right. They both got killed. He frowned, staring at me, turning a little pale. Then he laughed, unwillingly, shaking his head.
Oh, Frank, what will I ever do with you?
Keep me standing around here a while longer, and you won't have to do anything. I'll keel over from hunger.
Unthinkable. Night, Frank.
Night, Stape. I headed for home. He didn't know anything. Didn't even guess anything. He was just staying in character, that was all. And I'd been stupid to get upset about it. So there wasn't anything to get up in the air about. But still, I was glad to get home. I was glad to have Joyce's arms around me, holding me tight, to hear her whisper that I was her boy and she would never leave me again. We sat down at the table, side by side. It was all ready. The dinner, I mean. It was good and it was hot. We sat next to each other, squeezing hands now and then. And I hadn't had much appetite before, but I really stowed it away. She poured the coffee, I lighted 2 cigarettes and gave her one. You asked me something last night. Now I'd like to tell you the answer.
I'm glad, Dolly. I was hoping you would.
You asked me if I was glad you'd come back. All I gotta say is, you're damn right I am. She leaned forward and kissed me.
I'm glad that you're glad, Dolly. It's wonderful to be back.
She cleared away the dishes and I helped her. She didn't want me to, but I did anyway. Then we moved into the living room. The light was turned down low. She curled up next to me on the lounge, her legs pulled up under her, her head resting against my shoulder. It was mighty peaceful and pleasant. I felt like if it could just be this way forever, I wouldn't ask a damn thing more. Joyce, I laughed.
Go ahead, honey. What were you going to say?
Oh, nothing much. Probably nothing will come of it.
Of what?
There's a chance to make some real dough. A pile of it. One of the fellas down at the store, one of the collectors, well, his brother-in-law is manager of a big gambling house out in Las Vegas, and the owners of the place haven't been treating him right, see? He's made him rich, and now they're about to kick him out. So he wrote his brother-in-law, this collector down at the store, and told him that if he could get up some money, this manager, would place it with a shill and let the shill win, and she hadn't said a word, hadn't changed her position, but all of a sudden the room seemed to have gotten cold and her shoulder felt stiff against mine. Well, I guess maybe that isn't such a good idea. Might get in trouble on a deal like that, but well, there's another proposition I run across, and...
Dolly, I have to know. Where did you get that money?
I leaned forward and stamped out my cigarette in an ashtray. I stayed leaned forward while I lighted another one, and then I sat back again and I yawned. Man, am I tired. You about ready to turn in, honey?
Dolly...
What? Oh, the money. I thought I told you about that. I caught a few old accounts at home last night, people that really owed us a wad, and...
I saw it, Dolly. I don't know how much there was, but I know there was a lot, a whole bag full.
I turned around and stared at her. I gave her the hard eye, trying to stare her down, and she didn't flinch. There was a little frown on her forehead, but it wasn't unfriendly. She didn't look tough, or like she might get tough. If she'd been that way, I'd have known what to do, but the way it was, I didn't. I couldn't have slugged her if I'd been paid to. I couldn't do anything. The silence must have gone on for 5 minutes. Finally, she reached out and took one of my hands in hers and spoke.
I came back to you, Dolly. It wasn't easy after everything that had happened between us, but I felt that I had to. I loved you, and I wanted to help you.
You don't hear me kicking, do you?
Do you remember last night, honey? Don't you think that after that... Don't you know that I love you and that you can trust me and that all I want is to help you?
I'll bet we get waked up pretty early in the morning. They've got a couple of cars switched onto the siding out here, and they'll probably be hooking on to them. She stood up, smoothed her house dress. She looked down at me, gave me a little nod like a teacher dismissing a kid.
All right, Dolly. I guess there's nothing more I can say. Perhaps it's my fault for leaving you when I should have known that you were... that a man who acted as you did wasn't himself and might... Oh, Dolly... Dolly, what have you done?
She threw her hands over her face and sat down on the lounge again, crying, sobbing helplessly, and she seemed so alone, as lost and scared as I'd been last night. Joyce, please, baby, what the hell? What are you acting that way for?
You know why. All that money. I'd hoped you'd tell me that there'd be some innocent explanation. And now I know that you can't explain. You're afraid and...
Oh, no. Wait just a minute, baby. I tried to pull her onto my lap. She moved her shoulders, shaking off my hands. I waited a minute looking at her, listening to her, feeling myself coming apart inside. Then I tried again, and that time I made it. I wanted to tell you about it, I said, but I wasn't sure I was going to get to keep it, see? So I thought I'd better hold off for a few days. Otherwise, you'd be counting on it, and then you'd be disappointed. She pulled her head away from my chest and looked at me.
What? How do you mean?
I found that money.
Oh, Dolly.
She started crying again.
Please, not anymore. I just can't stand it if you lie to me any...
I'm not lying. I know it sounds crazy as hell. I could hardly believe it myself, but it's true.
But it...
I'm telling you. I'll tell you if you give me a chance. She sniffled and looked at me again. Finally, she nodded.
All right, Dolly. But please don't... If it isn't true, don't...
I can't guarantee that you'll believe me. I've been afraid that no one would believe me, and that's what makes it so hard to know what to do.
I want to believe you, honey.
Well, it happened last night. One of my accounts, a skip named Estel, I got a tip that he was living out on West Agnew Street. So I beat it out there, and the house was empty. If he'd ever lived in that place, he wasn't anymore. Well, I got my flash out of the car and went inside and...
Went inside? Why?
You'd know if you'd ever done any collecting, honey. If you'd ever worked for an outfit like Payez. We always go in if we can get in. You might pick up a telephone number off the wall, or maybe there's been an old letter left behind, something that will give you a lead on the skip. Her frown faded, and some of the doubt went out of her eyes.
Go on, honey.
So I went in, and I looked around from room to room, and I couldn't find a thing. Not a scrap of paper or an address or nothing. It almost looked like someone had gone to a lot of trouble to see that nothing was left behind. It was screwy. It got me curious, so I kept on looking, and finally I found this little satchel pushed way back on the shelf on one of the bedroom closets. I opened it up and looked inside, and I'm telling you, it really threw me for a loop. I paused to light a cigarette. I offered her one, giving her a quick size-up. She'd swallowed it all so far. It was a pretty good yarn, and she was anxious to swallow it.
What did you say this man's name was, honey? This man you were tracing when...
Estelle, Robert Estelle. I've got his card here in my pocket if you want to look at it. I took the card out and showed it to her. It was on the level. Actually, his card, which was a hell of a lot more than I could say for him. We'd got 2 payments out of him, and then he'd done the disappearing act. I can show you the empty house, too. I can drive you out there right now.
No, that's not necessary. How much money is there, Dolly?
I started to lie, to tell her there was 5 or 10 grand or some such figure, but she wasn't completely sold, yet. She asked to look at the money, to count it. I told her the truth. She almost fell off my lap.
Dolly, 100,000... It must have been stolen, or it could be kidnapped money, or...
Well, it's not marked, I know that. I checked it over, but good.
It's bound to be something like that. You've got to take it to the police, Dolly.
I suppose there is something shady about it, like there probably is. Where does that leave me? A floater with no friends or background? I'll tell you what would happen. If they couldn't beat me into signing some kind of confession, they'd lock me up until they could dig up the right answers.
But if you took the money in, that should prove that...
They never believe me. They think I was trying to do a cover-up. That's what makes it so hard, why I've been so worried. The story sounds screwy. I can hardly believe it myself, and I don't reckon you believe it, and... I shoved her off my lap suddenly. I went into the kitchen and reached a pint out of the cupboard, and I took a long, stiff slug from the bottle. I'd thought of something right while I was talking, and it had rattled me like lightning on a tin roof. The dough wasn't marked. I knew that. But suppose there was something actually shady about it. Suppose the cops or the FBI were on the lookout for certain serial numbers. I shivered. Then I remembered, and I sighed with relief. Mona had bailed me out of jail with a part of the money 4 days ago. If the stuff was hot, I'd have known about it by now. I put the bottle back in the cupboard. I turned back around, and Joyce was there, and she threw her arms around me.
I believe you, Dolly.
Her voice sort of desperate.
I believe every word of it.
I'll be frank with you, honey. I wouldn't blame you much if you didn't.
What are you going to do, Dolly? We can't keep it.
What else can we do? I won't say that I don't want to keep it, but even if...
Couldn't you go out to that neighborhood and make some inquiries? Find out?
Attract a lot of attention to myself and maybe have someone call the cops?
But we just can't...
Tell me what we can do. You don't want me to go to jail, do you?
No. Oh, no, dear.
If I thought it would do any good, I would. But all I can see is getting fouled up. That much money, if it was stolen, it must have been insured, and the insurance money's already been paid over. No one's out anything but the insurance companies. And they already got half the money in the world. She was silent, thinking. You and me, Joyce. We never really had a chance, honey. It was always one goddamn dump after another, never having a nickel to spare. Her arms tightened. She whispered.
Oh, Dolly, I love you so much.
100,000. And it belongs to us just as much as it belongs to anyone.
I don't know, Dolly. I want to. I want to so much.
Why don't you look at it? Count it. Let's count it together, honey. Figure out how we can spend it. Like to do that? Huh?
Well, no. I better not. It's hard enough just to think straight as it is. Let's just not talk about it anymore. Let's...
I picked her up in my arms and carried her into the bedroom. I had a good night. I got off to a good start the next morning. Joyce was pretty thoughtful and a shade pale around the gills, as the saying is, but that was the way it should be. She was a swell kid, always been on the level, and naturally something that wasn't strictly kosher would give her a jolt. I bought a paper on the way into town. I had to turn through it twice before I found the story about, well, you know. And it wasn't really about that then. It was just mentioned in passing in connection with a little squib about the old woman's estate. The county was filing a suit for the back taxes. Mona had been served with a 30-day eviction notice. I threw the paper away. I drove on to the store thinking that the poor kid really wasn't getting any breaks, If the property had been clear, she might have got a nice piece of change for it, enough to live on a couple of years and make a new start somewhere. But it wasn't in the cards. She was just the original hard-luck kid. Of course, I'd give her a few bills. I wouldn't let her be put out on the street with no clothes and not a dime to her name. I wondered if she had any money to eat on, and I thought for a minute of slipping a few bills in an envelope and sending it to her, but I finally decided against it. The police might be keeping an eye on the place. She'd get by all right. The way she was used to living, she probably wouldn't feel right if she had enough to eat. Staples usually opened the store at 8:30, a half hour before I and the other outside men went to work. But he hadn't done it that morning. It was a few minutes before 9 when I got there, and the place was still closed up tight, and the other guys were waiting out front for him to show. At 9:30, he showed up. He unlocked, and we followed him inside. It didn't seem to be done deliberately, but somehow the other guys were all checked out ahead of me, and I was left alone with him. He began checking me out, kidding and laughing. I felt myself getting uneasy. He just wasn't himself. He was in too damn good humor. Well, sure, he was always ribbing and making with the fast talk, but it was about as genuine as a dime store diamond. This morning was different. The son of a bitch was really tickled pink about something. I picked up my cards and asked him what the big joke was.
I paid a call on an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in almost 20 years.
No kidding. You mean you go out to this nut house? They got you inside, and then they let you go?
You're getting warm, dear boy. The friend I visited, the acquaintance, I should say, was in a public institution.
Jail, huh? I knew it.
No, you're still a little wide of the mark. It wasn't actually jail, more of a corollary establishment, I should say.
Yeah?
An adjunct to the jail, but I see that I'm boring you. Away, good friend. Oh, yes.
I know. You want me to knock 'em dead again.
Knock them? Oh, well put. Very well put.
I turned my back on him and walked out. My stomach was all tight and funny feeling, like I'd swallowed something heavy, and hot, icy needles were jabbing through my head. I got in my car so shaky that I could hardly turn the switch key. I backed away from the curb and started driving aimlessly. Finally, I pulled up at a bar and parked myself in a rear booth. The drinks helped. I began to calm down. He couldn't know anything. The cops didn't, so how could he? Somehow he'd spotted that I was a little uneasy. He'd seen it and started working on it, trying to needle out the answer. This Framus this morning now, it just about had to be a damned lie, and an ordinary guy would have come right out and admitted that he overslept or got stuck in an elevator or something of the kind, but Staples would just lie for the hell of it. So since he wanted to needle me anyway, he'd come up with this story about visiting an old friend, a friend that wasn't anywhere I could pin down, a big mystery, a lot of double talk. If he just hadn't been so damn tickled with himself, that would be part of the act, another scatter shot. Or maybe he had actually screwed someone and it had put him in a good humor. Anyway, he didn't know anything. Damn it, he didn't know anything. But I sure didn't feel like working. What I wanted to do was to go home, not do anything, but just stay there all day close to Joyce. It was out of the question. She was already bothered about the money, so upset that she hadn't even wanted me to leave it there in the house with her. She was about ready to go along with keeping it instead of going to the police, but she still didn't like it. I had 4 or 5 drinks in that bar, stretching them out until around noon. Then I went back to my car and started driving again. I drove to the outskirts of town and turned off on a dirt road. I parked. I opened my sample case. I took 12 of the $5 bills this time, enough to add up to a full day's work. I fingered them, hesitating, thinking, and then I put 6 of them back and took 3 10s instead. That was more like it. 12 5s and nothing else might look a little funny. I put the bills in my cash bag. I spread the collection cards out on my clipboard and doctored them. Then, that was all. There was nothing left to do. I had almost 5 hours to do it in. I started driving again. I guess there's nothing that'll get you down so fast as driving when you've got no place to go. I kept thinking how nice it would be to go home, knowing it was out of the question, and I began to get sore. The guy's sick and worried, and he can't even go to his own home, talk to his own wife. It was a damn sorry state of affairs, if you ask me. The man knocks himself out, puts himself on the spot on account of her, and she keeps right on giving him a hard time. Mona wouldn't act like that. That little Mona was real sweet. She'd had to do a few things she shouldn't have done, so maybe she wasn't high class like Joyce. Like Joyce pretended to be, but Joyce wasn't much good at pretending. She'd told me off plenty of times in the past. The way she'd acted was the way she felt. But Mona was okay, too, and I needed to see her. I needed to be with someone, to talk to someone. Someone, almost anyone, that was on my side. I drove to that center where she sometimes shopped. I went into the little bar there next to the drugstore and sat down near the door. It was one of those places that makes you wonder how the hell they stay in business. An old codger nursing a dime beer, some painted-up dame getting high on sherry. That's all there was. I had a couple of double scotches. I told the bartender to pick himself up a buck tip, and I thought he was going to drop dead. He set a bowl of peanuts in front of me. He dropped a handful of slugs into the jukebox. "Anything else, sir?" "I'll let you know." He took the hint and left me alone. I turned a little sideways on my stool. I sat looking up front, drinking and thinking, and the time loafed by. I bought another drink, and the bartender bought me one. I took a swallow or two from it, glanced at my watch. It was a few minutes after 3. Probably she wouldn't be by. You never can see people when you really want to, so probably I wouldn't get to see her. I got up and went back to the John. I came out, and there she was, just going by. I sauntered up to the door like I wanted to get a breath of air. She went into the supermarket. I waited a couple of minutes, and then I went back to my stool. I stood by it, sipping my drink and watching the door out of the corner of my eye. The jukebox had run out of slugs. The dame and the old codger had left. It was quiet in there, and I heard her. Heard those fast footsteps of hers before I saw her. I got to the door just as she was passing. I let her pass. I wanted to talk to her, but there was something I wanted worse, something I wanted to know, so I let her go on by and stood in the door watching until she rounded the corner 2 blocks away. I watched her and the cars on the street, the people, and then she was out of sight, and I felt a hell of a lot better. She wasn't being tailed. The police weren't keeping an eye on her. She was in the clear, which meant I was, so that jerk Staples could take his goddamn needle, and I went back to my stool, kind of sorry I hadn't got to talk to her, because she was a swell kid, you know, but glad that I handled it in this way.